Shit. Matt knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and now the owner of the firm he worked for wanted to see him immediately. He stood up and headed toward Dan Connor's office. His thoughts were racing. There was no way Dan would know about this. As accountant and general manager, Matt was the only one who saw the details of the company's transactions, and by the end of the month, all the accounts were balanced. Matt was sweating and feeling sick as he reluctantly knocked on the door. He reminded himself that Dan never checked the detailed accounts unless there were obvious discrepancies in the balance sheets. He was always more concerned with his designer suits, fast cars, and chasing women. Dan looked serious and nodded to the chair as Matt entered. Matt's illusion of security was immediately shattered. "I guess the question I need to ask is, how long have you been ripping me off?" Matt's head began to spin. "What? I have no idea what you're talking about." He continued to deny until Dan provided transaction logs proving that a significant amount of money had spent some time in one of Matt's personal accounts before being returned to the company. He realized he had been caught red-handed. "I'm sorry, Dan. I just needed a short-term loan until the temporary loan company got in touch. Otherwise, we would have lost the new house Susan was counting on. I didn't steal it. I paid it back as soon as I could and before the end of the month. I don't know how they classify it, Matt, as theft or fraud, but you're facing jail time. Even without that, you could lose your job. I can't trust you after this." "Please give me a chance. It was a moment of madness. I've been with the company for almost 20 years, and I've never thought of doing anything like this before, and I won't do it again." Dan stood looking out the window, seemingly in deep thought. "You and Susan have been my friends for a long time. I guess that makes the situation even more frustrating. Did Susan know you did it?" Matt was surprised by the question. He wondered, it had actually been Susan's idea. She was so desperate not to lose the house that she had suggested it, assuring Matt that no one would ever find out. Matt thought that involving Susan might mean that Dan wouldn't report it to the police, but he didn't want to implicate her. And after a long pause, he said, "No, she's not the one who knows. It was my idea." Dan seemed surprised by Matt's answer, but let it pass his ears. "I need time to think it over, Matt. I'm not sure how best to proceed. Go home, don't come back for the rest of the week. I'll make a decision on Friday." All the way home, Matt couldn't figure out how Dan knew about it, after all. No one ever went over the deals, and Dan certainly didn't handle the details. His biggest concern was which option Dan would choose. None of them were very appealing, but the embarrassment of a court case and jail time was throwing him into a blind panic. He knew Susan wouldn't be expecting him. Looking at their new house, he deeply regretted buying the damn thing in the first place. He suddenly remembered all those stories where the guy comes home early in the morning and discovers his wife is having an affair. Wouldn't that be the end of a perfect day? Fortunately, when he entered the kitchen, Susan was as bright, sunny, and fully dressed as usual. He marveled again at her beauty. She was barely 40 years old. Her long, curly brown hair was styled in a coiffure and lay over deep brown eyes. He liked her figure better, with a few curves and a lot more cleavage than when they'd first gotten married. Most of all, he liked her smile, which he was going to put away for the foreseeable future. Matt told Susan about his conversation with Dan and what evidence he had. Susan replied, "Oh my God, honey, I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. It was my idea and all for this stupid house." Matt shrugged. "I told Dan you don't know anything. It's pointless to get us both into trouble." Susan, "Maybe if I talk to him and ask him?" Matt thought about it and suggested they just wait. He knew this was going to be the longest 3 days of his life. They could try begging if Dan chose the option of destruction. He wondered what he would do if he were Dan. They were friends outside of work. They often met up and attended parties together. Maybe that gave him a small chance. Dan sent a text telling them he was coming over to their house at 7 p.m. on Friday night. Both Matt and Susan were sick with anticipation. Dan's Aston Martin pulled up to the house just in time. The man who has everything, Matt reflected. Good looks, money, the ability to charm, and now also the ability to destroy it. He ushered Dan forward. A few strained greetings, and Susan, as usual, offered him a beer. Before he could say anything, Matt stepped into the conversation. "I just want to say I'm really sorry, Dan. I've let you and myself down big time. I realize I've put myself in a desperate situation, and I can handle whatever decision you make." Dan smiled oddly. "I really hope that's true, Matt." The ensuing silence stretched on, becoming unbearable before Dan finally continued. "You know, I'm a little jealous of you, Matt. Your relationship with Susan, I miss that in my life." Matt was surprised. He had always thought Dan had everything, including an endless string of hot girlfriends. Maybe approaching 30, he was going to settle down. "So, with that in mind, I have a suggestion. It won't please either of you, but it's the only scenario in which you can avoid jail time, Matt. And remember, there is a risk to Susan as well, since the account was joint and used to secure a house in both your names. Also, I know you wouldn't have done this without her consent." Matt panicked at the thought of Susan being held accountable. He had no idea what that sentence might include. Dan took a slow, long breath. "It's not easy to say, but my suggestion is that I spend time with Susan." There was a stunned silence. Dan continued. "No police, no court cases or jail. You stay at work, you stay together, but I will spend every Friday night with her." "Dan, you can't be serious," Matt whispered. "Dan, I am totally serious. I have desired Susan all these years, and this is an opportunity I just can't resist." "Susan, there has to be another option. We can pay more, anything but—" "Dan, this is my only offer. I've been told I'm not looking too bad. I hope it's not too heavy a burden for you. Perhaps when things settle down, the arrangement won't be too uncomfortable for either of us. Susan, we need time to think about it. We can't decide something like this quickly." Matt turned his head. "You can't think about agreeing to this, baby. Are you crazy?" "Susan, I don't see any alternatives, dear, and we've been trying to think of them all week." Matt growled, looking at Dan. "You pathetic, low-life scum. This is a sick idea." Dan smiled back. "That may be true, Matt, but I'm not a thief. You are." Dan turned to Susan. "If we're doing this, we need to start right now. You don't have time to figure out how to get out of this." After 15 minutes of yelling and accusations, Dan stood up. "Time to decide. I'm either going to the car or I'm going upstairs with Susan." He smiled and held out his hand to Susan. After some hesitation, Susan took it. Matt was literally stunned and abruptly sat back in his chair. "Susan, Matt, we have no alternative. Everything will be fine." She then led Dan through the living room and up the stairs. Time seemed to stop for Matt. There was silence in the room. Had this conversation really just happened? His thoughts jumped to what was happening upstairs. He heard them moving around, a muffled conversation, and then the distinct sound of someone sitting on the bed. Long minutes passed in silence. Then he heard the first creak of the bed, the unmistakable sound of two people beginning to have sex. The movements and sounds continued. Then the creaking became regular, and combined with the muffled moans, it became faster and louder. There seemed to be no end to it, and Matt thought that maybe he was going crazy. Matt felt ashamed and guilty. He wiped his cheeks and eyes, waiting for Dan and Susan to come back downstairs, but again there was muffled talking and some movement. After a long silence, Matt stood up, thinking he should check to see if Susan was okay, when he heard something again. The creaking of the bed. He walked to the foot of the stairs and heard something else, including snippets of Dan talking. "That's it, baby." The most discouraging sound, however, was Susan's fairly constant whimpering, occasionally interspersed with "yeah" and Matt needed to get out of the house. He hurried out and walked aimlessly down the street. Was Susan really enjoying this, or was she putting on a show for Dan? He began to wonder how vigorously she objected to the idea. He was not unmoved by the fact that Dan was 10 years younger than him and handsome. By the time he reached the park, his thoughts had changed. Susan was doing this to keep him out of jail. He needed to get back to the house and make sure she was okay as much as possible. Aston Martin was still there, but the house was quiet when he entered. He made his way to the kitchen and grabbed a beer. Turning around, he saw Susan behind him in a short robe. They looked at each other, both confused, before Matt could speak. "Are you okay?" Susan smiled weakly. "Yeah, thanks for asking," then continued. "He's being nice, nothing rough or weird, just normal sex. I'm sorry if you heard something." Matt shrugged. At least it's over. Susan looked uncomfortable and replied, Actually, he wants to do it again. He was thirsty, so I came to get a beer and wanted to check on you. Geez, he must have been saving it for you. Susan. Why don't you go to the den? You'll feel better there, maybe quieter. See if you can figure a way out of this. Matt stayed in the room for another hour and had made no progress toward a solution when he heard footsteps coming down the stairs. He stepped out into the hall and saw Dan suppress a smile before breaking the awkward silence. Look, I know this isn't easy for you, Matt. I promised to treat Susan with the utmost respect, and I can't thank you enough for letting me spend time with her. I hope you feel better, and of course work matters will remain between us. Matt replied, Don't thank me. You left us no choice. Dan and Susan both looked uncomfortable. Obviously, it was time for him to leave. To Matt's surprise, as Dan was saying goodbye, Susan kissed him. It wasn't a blazing kiss, but it was on his lips and lingered for a second. Matt didn't have time to say anything before Dan was gone. He looked at Susan. What the hell was that? Susan realized she had made a mistake. What? Oh, it was just a kiss. Goodbye. No, not just. It was a sign of affection. I think you two had a good time, and I shouldn't have been so worried. Susan got angry. I can't believe your boss just screwed me 3 times thanks to your actions, and you're worried about a goodbye kiss. Matt. It was supposed to be a deal. An arrangement. Just sex. Did you kiss him upstairs? Susan. I guess a little, but not much. Matt. Great. First a few times, then I hear you like it, and now some caresses too. In response, Susan became enraged. It's not like that. Everything I do is designed to keep us out of jail. I will have to be willing and make him enjoy himself. We're both going to have to get used to this. If I can get through it, you have to find a way to get through it too. That last remark knocked all the energy out of Matt. Despite his doubts about her actions, Susan had made the sacrifice, not him. She could have just walked away. And where would he be then? Probably in jail. Matt couldn't be in the master bedroom knowing what had happened there, so they slept in the guest room, snuggled together. Susan fell fast asleep, no doubt exhausted. Matt didn't sleep a wink. His mind was in constant turmoil, desperately trying to think of a way out of this hell. It seemed that for the whole of the next week, they hardly spoke at all. The only topic of conversation was how to get out of their predicament. Matt came up with various plans, most of which were useless. Even when a viable solution occurred to him, Dan seemed to be ahead of him. One of them included the idea of destroying all evidence, only to find out that Dan had deleted his access to backups and claimed he had stored all financial data in a new secure cloud system. Eventually, the next Friday came around, and Dan sent a text saying he intended to take Susan out to dinner, under the pretense that it would make things easier to handle. Matt wasn't sure it was easier. On the one hand, a date felt more like a relationship. On the other hand, it meant less time in bed with Susan. As it turned out, he got the worst of both options. Susan seemed very depressed about the idea of a date, but still prepared herself. Matt thought she put too much effort and looked too good when Dan came to pick her up. Watching her in a little black dress and stiletto shoes being ushered into Dan's Aston Martin was heartbreaking. The evening that followed was even worse. He sent Susan numerous texts, asking if she was okay. Each time he received a short reply saying she was fine, just having dinner or just drinking. Eventually, they got back at 10 p.m. Dan hugged Susan as they entered the house. They were both laughing and seemed to be in good spirits. Matt looked around. Susan seemed to be having too good a time again and was quite drunk. We never agreed this was going to be a dating thing. Dan replied, Relax, Matt. It was just dinner and drinks between friends. If this is going to be awkward, maybe we should just go straight up. Matt growled. What do you mean, right away? Dan's smile returned. We made a deal every Friday, Matt, so tonight I'll sleep with Susan, and I'm sure you'll manage in the spare room. Drunk or not, Susan recognized the tension. Thinking Matt was going to attack Dan, she led him into the kitchen, whispering, It'll be okay, honey. I'll deal with him quickly, and then I'll pretend to be drunk and go to bed. Remember, we don't have a choice. Matt withdrew, feeling an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. He heard Susan giggling as they went upstairs, which he hoped was a pretense for Dan, but he couldn't help but wonder if it was a pretense for Dan or for him. An exhausted Matt finally went to bed in the spare room. Every time he woke up, he heard the creak of the bed in the bedroom, so much for quickly feeling pulled apart. When he came downstairs in the morning, Dan was already sitting at the table and Susan was making breakfast. He'd had enough. "Piss off, Dan. It's not Friday and your time is up." Susan began with, "That's not necessary, Matt. We can be polite. It's just—" Matt interrupted. "You have 10 seconds to get out of my house." Dan looked like he was about to argue, but got up to leave, and as he walked out the door, he reminded Matt, "Don't forget what you can get out of this, Matt." Matt turned to Susan. "Make him breakfast, really? You've got to be kidding me. Why don't you just move in with him? You're more his wife now than mine." He ran out before she could think of a response. On the third Friday, Dan suggested they spend the night in a hotel to avoid further confrontation with Matt. Susan left at 6 p.m. dressed as usual, which she thought would be easier for Matt. The plan was for her to change in the hotel room, and Dan was to meet her at the restaurant. She was a little overwhelmed by the luxury of the hotel. Her casual clothes didn't match the setting. She took the key to the pre-booked room, and upon entering, she discovered it was a suite. There were flowers on the table and 2 gift-wrapped boxes on the bed. Opening the larger box, she found a very expensive and glamorous silver satin full-length dress with a neckline and a thigh-length slit. The second box contained a red satin corset, matching thong and luxurious black stitched stockings. She hesitated, but decided there was no harm in trying them on. Surprisingly, they all fit perfectly, and she had to admit that she felt very good in them. She made the decision not to take them off and went down to the restaurant. Dan greeted her, gaping at how stunning Susan looked. The dinner and wine that followed was exquisite. The atmosphere was very tense, knowing what would follow. In Dan's company, Susan felt more relaxed and decided to go along with the whole scenario rather than fight against it. When they returned to the room, the way Dan slowly undressed her, being very sensual, she enjoyed his reaction to her underwear. His hands slid all over her body. She loved the way the corset emphasized her breasts and hips, and the stockings felt so luxurious and exquisitely silky. She had to admit that Dan was an attentive and caring lover, with an element of confidence and danger that she had never encountered with her husband. The next morning, after another bout of sex, Susan changed into her casual clothes. She explained to Dan that she couldn't risk taking her dress or underwear home. Dan agreed to keep them at his house for Susan's future use. Susan sighed, remembering that this would be a long-term arrangement. Her emotions were in turmoil. She wasn't sure how she felt about what was happening. There was plenty of guilt, of course, but she couldn't deny the feelings of excitement and satisfaction. Matt lay awake for most of Friday night. By 10 a.m. Saturday morning, Susan hadn't returned, and once again, this was outside the realm of agreement. He doubted Dan would resist taking Susan again this morning, and he wasn't sure she would even try to avoid it. No matter how much he tried to resist, he was losing trust in Susan, and if that happened, it could mean the end of his marriage. He had never felt so far away from Susan and so alone. "Susan, that kiss was such a bad move. It upset Matt more than anything else, and then breakfast for Dan. What was I thinking?" In fact, she was beginning to think the whole thing was a terrible idea. From her point of view, her time with Dan was easier than she thought. He was respectably handsome and exciting. The money and cars certainly helped. She always aspired to better things. Her dilemma was that sex with him was hot, very hot. It was a constant struggle to keep from screaming, yelling, and asking for more. She had hoped that Matt would get used to what was happening and come to his senses. But it had been 3 weeks, and he remained moody. They hadn't made love either, which she desperately wanted to fix. She loved him so much and regretted the position they were now in. She tried to tell Matt that she was coping and he shouldn't feel guilty. Then she said that Dan was good to her. It was just sex, not love, and he didn't want to keep them apart, but it had no effect. Matt looked defeated and lost, his constant reassuring presence in her life becoming a distant memory. When he arrived at work on Monday, Dan informed Matt that he needed to attend a training event out of town on Wednesday and Thursday next week. Matt was immediately wary, but given his precarious position at work, he had no choice but to agree. "Okay, I can do that, but it doesn't affect our personal relationship. You can't come over when I'm not home." Dan replied, "Of course not." When he broke the news to Susan that evening, she didn't seem surprised or concerned. The course wasn't a regular occurrence, but it happened once or twice a year. It just seemed too convenient for Matt. He went to the kitchen. His intention to plan his way out of the predicament lost the battle against the blinding headache. As he walked back up the stairs to find a painkiller, he heard Susan talking on the phone, catching her part of the conversation. He wondered who she was talking to and listened to her part of the conversation. "What are you doing, sending Matt on a trip?" "No, that's not a good idea. Things aren't working out, and you coming along will only make things worse." "No, he hasn't thought of anything yet. He seems to have given up and resigned himself to it." "I thought it wouldn't be like this. He's devastated. You know I like our time together. I know it was my idea, but I didn't expect him to be so upset. It was supposed to be a safe alternative to our affair without the risk of being discovered. I didn't envision all of this. I helped you with the kissing and breakfast, and meanwhile you acted like an arrogant asshole smirking in his face." "Okay, you can come during his trip, but then I think we'll need to cut it all short and be more restrained, or maybe even end it. If you offer to end this arrangement because you see how it's affecting Matt, then you'll be a good guy, and we can get back to normal. Maybe if you're careful, we could see each other occasionally." "Yeah, we'll talk later, but I really need to fix things with Matt. I still love him." Matt staggered down the stairs, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. He really had just heard it all. He couldn't fathom all the implications. No wonder Dan seemed to have anticipated all his plans. Susan had told him about it beforehand, and it had been her idea in the first place. She had suggested it and convinced Matt to borrow the money against his better judgment. It also explained how Dan had discovered the discrepancy in the first place. It was so hidden that he didn't think even an audit would have been able to find it. If he wasn't married to a saint, which kept him out of jail, he was actually married to a cheating and conniving bitch. Thoughts of revenge and violence flashed through his mind. Everything came over him. He knew he had to calm down and think rationally. He needed a plan, preferably one that would make them start to sense his anxiety. Matt avoided Susan for the rest of the night and the next morning. When he saw Susan on Tuesday night, he didn't mention the overheard call, but said he heard Dan at work bragging about getting some top-notch woman. Matt went on to say that he could only pray that he didn't mention Susan by name. Matt left early Wednesday morning for his trip, and Susan told him that she loved him. He smiled briefly and pretended to be distracted, checking the schedule on his phone as he set off. Dan arrived at Susan's on Wednesday morning, and she immediately asked about the bragging, but Dan denied everything, blaming Matt for stirring things up. Susan didn't know who to believe. She saw no reason why Matt could have made it up, but maybe Dan was less discreet than she thought, which would be problematic. In between sex, they discussed the situation and what they could do about it. Susan lacked the emotional connection she had with Matt. What she had with Dan was purely sex. Before leaving Thursday afternoon, Dan convinced Susan to continue their affair, but Susan made it clear that it would be the last time until things got better with her and Matt. As they walked out of the house, Dan stopped, unable to believe what he was looking at. There was a large kitchen knife lying on the gleaming hood of his Aston Martin. He looked around, but no one was there. All 4 tires were slashed, too. He went back into the house and told Susan. They both started to panic. Matt could have come home earlier that he knew. It had to be him, unless it was kids or someone jealous of the flashy car. This wasn't the first time it had been vandalized. Susan called Matt and asked how the course went. He casually confirmed that it went uneventful. He didn't need to be there and was starting to get ready to go home. He spoke calmly and didn't ask about Dan. Susan said she couldn't wait to see him and ended the conversation. She recounted the conversation to Dan, saying that he didn't seem upset. Maybe it was just the kids. Either way, they needed to get the car towed before Matt got home, which led to several frantic calls and expensive payments. All seemed normal when Matt returned Thursday night. Susan tiptoed around him, playing the dutiful wife. The surprise was Dan's text message confirming that he wanted to come over on Friday, but only to discuss the situation. Susan smiled, thinking that Dan was going to put an end to everything. Maybe the car had scared him enough to stop everything. Friday morning, Matt went to work as usual. At 11 a.m., he called Susan from work in a panic-stricken voice, telling her that there was something she needed to see. Matt explained that he had just received a video clip via their personal email, and she needed to see it. Susan opened their email on her phone, found the message, and opened the video clip. The video quality was poor and only 20 seconds long, but it was unmistakably Susan and Dan having sex. The sender was an anonymous address. Matt. "Oh my God, is that our bedroom? It's hard to tell, but it looks sunny. Looks like the middle of the day, so I'm not sure when it might be." Susan knew exactly when it was, but replied, "I'm not sure. Maybe it's edited, and they messed up the light." Matt. "It's you, isn't it? You seem to like it." Susan let that comment pass her ears. She had more important concerns and could explain her enthusiasm to Matt later as part of the introduction to Dan. Matt continued, "What Dan is playing is what he wanted to discuss tonight. Isn't this just another form of torture? It's not like you lashed out and threatened him." Susan immediately started to deny it, but then remembered telling Dan of her intention to end the relationship. Perhaps he had reacted badly and intended to use the videotape to continue the relationship. He must have set up the videotape at some point. He'd had ample opportunity to do so over the course of 2 days. Matt said that Dan wasn't at work, so he couldn't ask him. Susan desperately wanted to contact him and was still hoping to discuss their activities over the previous few days. At that moment, Susan's phone rang with an urgent call me message. It was her sister, Diane. She told Matt that she had better answer it, hoping it would give her time to think. She finished talking to Matt and called Diane, but was met with a barrage of questions and scolding. When Diane finally caught her breath, Susan managed to find out that her sister had gotten the same video clip. Her phone continued to beep with calls that most of her close friends and even her mom tried to make. My God, did they all really get that clip? It was an absolute disaster. There was no way Matt could have done this to me. It had to be Dan. Susan was furious. She had tried repeatedly to call Dan but couldn't get an answer. The reason she couldn't reach Dan was because Matt had taken his phone at work when he was in a meeting. He had thrown the battery in the trash and kept the handset and SIM card. He also left an envelope on Dan's desk, after which he called Susan about the video and quietly left work. Back at home, Matt enjoyed watching his wife upset and confused by what was happening. She was upset that her mom had seen the video, and all her family and friends would think she was having an affair. Matt played along, making various unhelpful suggestions about how to limit the damage and adding his own doubts about when the clip might have been filmed. Susan still didn't acknowledge Dan's midweek visit. Susan, how could things have gone so horribly wrong? She never thought about having an affair until she got drunk at a party and started flirting too much with Dan. He was handsome, attractive, and clearly interested. After that night, he'd been on her mind a lot. Over the weeks, she'd managed to convince herself that she deserved some excitement, but dared not risk her marriage to Matt. She'd seen her friend's marriage fall apart after a similar affair was discovered, but she'd always been smart and thought her plan was a smart way to avoid all the pitfalls of discovering an affair. After all, how could Matt discover something he already knew about? Working out the details had become a challenge, and that was all part of the excitement. From her point of view, it was a wonderful arrangement, but she had never thought about how it would affect Matt. Now she was in a lot of pain. Everyone liked Matt, and everyone knew she had cheated on him. She dreaded imagining how she would try to explain her way out of the situation. No one would ever believe that Matt knew about her sex with Dan. But none of that mattered as long as she could convince Matt that it wasn't her fault. The squeal of Dan's tires heralded his arrival at Matt and Susan's house. He was met by Susan trying to attack him. Matt did nothing to stop her, noting the impressive scratch on Dan's cheek. Eventually, Dan managed to pin Susan against the wall long enough for her to talk. Dan heard about the video, but insisted that he hadn't filmed or sent it. Susan got angry. "But if it wasn't you, then who—" Matt started laughing. "Then it must have been me." Susan and Dan looked dumbfounded. Dan was the first to pick up on it. "So you found out about our meeting this week?" Matt: "Alas, yes." Susan began trying to justify it as a continuation of the arrangement. Once again, Dan caught all the implications of the videotape. He knew they had discussed the whole situation and suspected that Matt had taped the whole thing. He tried to smooth things over a bit. "I'm sorry, Matt. I just couldn't resist Susan. I never meant for it to hurt you like that. I made a big error in judgment and just got carried away. I will terminate the contract and ignore the financial irregularities." Matt: "That's so nice of you, but I'm afraid it's too late. You'll find my resignation letter on your desk." Susan cut in: "You can't, Matt. How are we going to pay for the house?" Matt: "Don't worry about it, honey. It will be on the market tomorrow." Dan jumped up: "No need, Matt. We can put this behind us. I really need you at the firm. You know the business and the clients inside out." Matt smiled: "I think that's true. Perhaps that's why your main competitor offered me the job. I suspect some, maybe even most of the clients will move with me. You owe me more vacation days than the 4-week notice period, so I won't be coming back." Dan's fake smile faded. Matt continued: "I suspect some of the staff will be leaving too. I told them I was leaving, and most of them don't seem to think you have what it takes to keep the company going." Dan seconded: "You need to think this through, Matt. You could still go to jail." Matt: "Oh, I don't think so. Would you want to involve your mistress? She got half the benefit of the fraud. Anyway, you committed blackmail, and thanks to your little effort here, I have this confession on video. It's amazing what electronic devices you can buy these days. The recording is in my attorney's possession. Also, you may find that some of your files were mistakenly deleted, and I know you didn't do a remote backup. It's good to have co-workers who enjoy working with you, but I guess you don't know that." Dan grinned: "That tape will never be presented in court." Matt replied: "Funny enough, my lawyer said the same thing, but I can use it for other purposes, and by the time this is settled, you'll be out of business. On the other hand, my new firm might want to buy you out. I hear their new COO is a decent man." Susan realized that compared to Dan, his business and money were in serious jeopardy. She decided to take it out on Dan. Dan listened in bewilderment as Susan launched into an impressive game of hurt woman. "I love you, Matt. It was all Dan's idea. He made me do it. I admit I got confused and a little carried away, but I was just going for it to save you from jail. I had no choice, and my life fell apart because of it. Please, Matt, I love you." Dan muttered: "You two-faced lying bitch." Matt smiled at such an apt description. "Ah, my dear, loving wife, in addition to the video, you're overlooking the fact that I overheard you confess on the phone that this was all your idea, a rather elaborate and cruel cover-up for an affair. You'll find the divorce papers in an envelope in the kitchen drawer. You're leaving tonight, and you have to agree to the terms of the divorce, or all those video clips could end up with family and friends. I'm sure your mom will be happy to hear that not only are you a cheating whore, but also the extent to which you schemed and blackmailed." Susan burst into tears and fell to the floor. Matt looked at Dan: "Do you want to take her with you?" Dan: "No way, she's more trouble than she's worth." Matt: "Well, I agree with that." Dan: "This isn't over, Matt." Matt: "That's true." At that moment, Matt took a swing at Dan, and he wasn't sure who was more surprised when his fist slammed into Dan's jaw, knocking him to the ground. "It's over now." Epilogue. Matt listened to the tape a few times. Most of it was excruciating, but he liked the part where Dan and Susan worried if he'd found out and gone crazy. The knife in the hood was wonderfully melodramatic, and he smiled for the first time in weeks. Matt had indeed taken a new job with Dan's competitor, and the customers and employees followed. Dan hung on as best he could, but eventually he had to put his firm into administration, and there were rumors of his personal bankruptcy. He moved out of the neighborhood shortly thereafter. Susan was left to live in a small apartment with the money from the sale of the house, but no other income from Matt. As a result, with no qualifications or experience, she worked 2 temporary jobs as a housekeeper and waitress. Her former friends shunned her, and she barely spoke to her mother and sister. A pay raise and bonuses allowed Matt to switch to a 3-day work week, and find time for the sports and outdoor activities he had neglected in his marriage. He didn't realize how much Susan had influenced his decisions, including buying a big house and filling it with stuff, but he wasted no time in selling it. He kept in touch with Susan's mother and sister. Diane, in particular, kept apologizing for her sister's cheating, assuring him that he would never repeat her mistake. Matt wondered exactly what she meant, thinking it would be fun to find out at some point, especially since Susan would be furious.